Reggie? Oh, okay. Okay. Oh, okay. Okay, Reggie is taking on the position of superintendent in Beardstown again. So be in prayer that goes well for him. All right. So this morning we're going to be in James chapter 1 and verse 9, and we're going to be continuing to look at the book of James and just looking at what real faith is. And, I'll probably say this several times throughout this, but James is giving us this deep look at what faith really is. And, faith, you can't just hardly encapsulate faith in a word, right? You can't just say, faith is believing. Because James is going to say, this is like, I've said it before and I'll say it again. James is like, here's 101 ways to know if your faith is real saving faith. Like 101 ways to find out if your faith is garbage or serious. Because he says it goes beyond just saying, I believe in the existence of God. And he's giving us all these ways to look at faith, and I would say that maybe one of them doesn't fully encapsulate it. We look at it from this view and this view and this view and this view, and none of them you can go overboard on, but all together they show us what true faith really is. So that as you may come to different people in your lives, and they may say, well, faith is just this. And, well, let's see what James says. Let's see what he says faith is, that we know what faith is by all the examples that he gives us. And today we're going to be talking about faith in regards to how you spend your life and the things that you pursue, and if they're seasonal things. Did you spend your life chasing after things that were seasonal, that it's like flowers that you plant and they die at the end of the year? Or did you spend your life chasing after long-term things that were eternal? And as we go through this book, one of the things that came to my mind is James in many ways is saying that if your life looks like a life of faith, then it is a life of faith. And I know we had some people came over to our house when we lived in Minnesota, young married couple, old enough that they should have seen a duck before in their life, okay? But they came to our farm, and they'd never seen a duck before. They've heard of ducks, but they'd never seen one, which blew my mind. But this guy comes over, he's like, honey, come look, this is a duck. She comes over, that's a duck? He's like, yeah, this is a duck, But we've all heard the illustration. I'm thinking, it walks like a duck, it looks like a duck, it quacks like a duck. It's a duck, right? We all know, right? So in a certain respect, this is what James is saying. He's like, here's a Christian. And they're like, that's a Christian? Does it walk like a Christian? Does it talk like a Christian? Does it act like a Christian? It's a Christian, right? This is somebody who their faith shows, and you look at them, maybe you've never seen one before, but you're going to recognize this one, okay? And he's giving us all these ways to look at a Christian's life and see, is this a real Christian? Is this real faith? Are they really someone who believes in the Lord? So starting off in verse 9, he's going to give us two lifestyles here. And he says, let the lowly boast in his exaltation. And he says, let the rich in his humility, or in his actually being humiliated. And it's like, he says, first off, here's two attitudes that would apply to whether or not you have the right lifestyle to go with what you say is faith. And he's like, let this lowly person praise God, that he's going to be exalted, that God is going to be like, take this lowly person and lift him high. And he says this rich person is going to absolutely be humiliated. And so it's not, so we got to look a little bit deeper, because we're like, well, it's not necessarily that just because someone has money, God is going to humiliate them. That, they have things of this world, so God is just going to, they can't have true faith. Well, we have to ask ourselves, what is James getting at? Because it's a little deeper than that, right? It can't, we know that there's people in the Bible who have some money, some blessings from God, right? So why is James saying that, 101 ways to know if you have true faith? And he says, let the lowly person who's focused on the right things be ready for God to exalt him, and let the rich person be ready to be humiliated. Why is he saying that this money is a bad sign in God's sight? And I think what it comes down to is your heart, your pride, your pursuits. What was important to you in this life? What did you chase after in this life? What were you going after? And I think he drives this home in the end of this verse. In the end of verse 10, he says, because like the grass, he will fade away. And it says that, it says like the flower of the grass, he will fade away. And so he has chosen, and it's not saying that it's impossible to have money and faith, okay? But this person has chosen to pursue the things in life that are gonna vanish. What sort of things? He's chosen to pursue everything in this world that people would think are valuable. And he's made his life all about that, and those things are not going to last, and they're going to go away. And what James is going to say is, it's as far as we're kind of peeling back the layers of an onion, okay? You can't just say, if you have money, you don't have faith. But he's saying, let's look deeper. If we could find 101 ways to describe what faith actually is in your life choices, he says, this person who pursues things that are temporary, that fade away like grass, that are like seasonal. You know, I plant zinnias every year, and I love zinnias because they bloom for like 3 or 4 months if they're kept right. But it just gets to be a struggle towards the end of the year. Towards the end of the year, that mid-July comes, the heat, the sun starts hitting them, and they start browning up, and I get out there and I try and water them all, and we get one more spruit. If we get some rain, they go, but eventually, they're just this cluster of dead brown mess, right? That is what money is, okay? And if you're pursuing all of the things of this world, he's saying it's just like grass. It's going to have a season. At the end of its season, it's done. So he's saying in reliance to our faith, if we're pursuing seasonal things in our life, it speaks badly about our faith, right? And he says this in verse 11. He says, the sun rises with its scorching heat and withers the grass, and its flower falls, and its beauty perishes. And he says, so will the rich man fade away in the midst of his pursuits. And he's like, listen, it's all seasonal. Grass is seasonal. It's scalded by the scorching sun. And whether or not it's winter that happens, or whether it's the heat of summer that happens, he says all of these things that are temporal are temporal. And he says, if you're someone, and I would say, I don't want to go against what James is saying, and I don't want to overemphasize what James is saying. I want to be right on what he's saying. And I think his point is that if you spent your life pursuing all of the things that are temporal, then you're going to vanish with all of the things that are temporal. Because your life was all about temporal. If your life was all about faith, your life would have been about godly things. It would have been about whether it was your pride and your passions and your pursuits, they wouldn't have all gone temporal. They would have gone in a large respect towards permanent, everlasting things. The things that you do with your life and pursue, and the things that make you glad and joyful would have had like a godly, everlasting tilt to them as well, right? And so I think John says this pretty well in 1 John 2:15. He says, love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. He says, if any man loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. And then he goes on to list, he says, for all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh, the desires of your eyes, and the pride of life, he says these things are not of the Father, but they are of the world. And he says the world is passing away along with all that is in it, but whoever does the will of the Father will remain forever. So he's saying, if you're really hitched your wagon to the things of this world, and they're all temporal, they're all going to be like those flowers, they're all going to be like that grass, and they're all going away. Who does he say remains at the end? He says whoever has chosen godly things will remain. And like I say again, I don't want to give you this wrong impression of faith that you're like, oh, the preacher says that faith, you can't have any money or things, right? But there is this element. As James is like, here's 101 ways to tell if your faith is any good. There's definitely an aspect of this that if you're all about temporary things that die in the heat of the sun, as in money and things of this world that all go away when Jesus Christ returns, then there is this side of it that's saying, how can your faith be good if you're pursued in your daily life Maybe not on Sunday morning, but on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday. What consumed your life and what did you chase after? What was important to you? What were you going for in your life? What were you gathering in your life? What was important in your life? And there's no doubt that this plays one role in understanding what real saving faith is. What did you pursue in your life? Did you ultimately, with your life, pursue the temporary or the eternal, right? Because that shows what, if our faith is any good. It's one side that shows all of it. So as we look at this, I think I told you in the beginning of this book that James, the brother of the Lord, really there's so many things that remind me in him of the teachings of Jesus. And Jesus taught a very similar thing to this. Jesus taught about young faith and whether or not it lasts by, in many ways, how it pursues, what it pursues and what it endures. And many of the things that James taught, Jesus taught the same thing. So James says here, was what we just looked at, he says the sun rises with its scorching heat, and the grass withers and the flower falls, and its beauty perishes. James says that it's like when the sun beats down on things and they die, you'll find out just like what people did and what they pursued. And when the Lord comes back, what did they pursue and what will remain? Were they rooted in things that were eternal? Or were the people rooted in things that were temporal? And I think of an illustration that Jesus gave that was very similar to this. Remember what Jesus said about the seed and the sower? And he says that Jesus compares salvation and faith to throwing seeds out to grow. And you remember the story, I'm sure you're familiar with it. The seeds fall on all sorts of soil. And each little sprout that pops up from a seed represented young faith. That, somebody who believed, but will they endure to the end? Will that faith be saving faith that takes them through to the end, right? So Jesus says all these seeds get thrown out and here's all this young faith springing up, but will they endure life's test, right? And as we think about this, Jesus says about the seed that falls in rocky ground in Matthew 13:5. He says other seed fell on rocky ground where it did not have much depth of soil. And since it did not have much depth of soil, it sprang up immediately. But then he says, but the sun rose and scorched it, and it died. It went away. So Jesus says, listen, there are some people who have this faith that's growing inside them. But then when the sun rises and it hits that growing faith, it scorches because it wasn't rooted in anything great. It wasn't rooted in anything deep. They didn't take faith and they didn't say, now I'll read my Bible, and now I'll pursue God. And now I'll try and get connected in a church. And now I'll live for my Lord. They didn't go for putting down roots in faith. They didn't go for godly things. They were just very surface level. And he says when the sun rose, it scorched that little sprout of faith and it was done, right? Very similar to what James is telling us. James is telling us if you're rooted in all temporary things, the sun is going to rise and scorch out that little sprout, and it's going to be done. And I think another thing is that what does Jesus say when he describes all of these seeds, and what did James say as he's started out this book? James has started out this book, and I keep calling it 101 Ways to Know If Your Faith Is Any Good, Dead, Alive, or Salvation Worthy. And James started out by saying, listen guys, you should be happy when there's trials and tribulations of all these different sorts. Because it's going to test your faith, and it's going to make you steadfast. Either trials and tribulations are going to kill your faith, and it's going to be dead, or it's going to be strengthened because you've endured through Christ, and it's conquering, right? And then James says, when money and pursuits of this sort of thing, and you pursue the wrong thing in your life, it's going to be like scorching heat that just like the sun rises and it just kills little you because you weren't founded in the right things. And listen to what Jesus says as he describes young faith by all of these seeds. Listen to what he says. He says in Matthew 13:21, he says about this little sprout of faith that didn't have much root. He says, but it had no root. And it says it endured for a little while, but when tribulation and persecution arose on account of the word, immediately it fell away. What did James say? James says tribulation and persecution are what's going to test that faith. They're going to put it to the test. Jesus says tribulation and persecution are going to be the tests that come to test that faith. And he says that young little sprout of faith is just going to die off if it's not rooted in something good, if it's not rooted in things that are godly, if it's just very surface level tribulation and persecution are going to be the end to that testing of seeing if that faith was real and deep and lasting. And then what about money? What did Jesus say about money? James says, warning to rich people who pursue things of this world. Because that little sprout of faith, how's it going to endure if you're pursuing riches and money? What does Jesus say in a very similar story about pursuing the right things? And that little sprout of faith, is it going to make it? Is it going to go through? Is that faith going to endure to become saving faith, that it's going to grow? Lots of people hear the message of salvation and like it. But what does Jesus say about money when it comes into the picture? Can that be something that can topple over your faith? Listen to what he says in the next verse in 13:22. He says, for what was sown among the thorns, meaning this little seed of faith that's growing among thorns, and now he's going to explain. He says, this is the person who hears the word, but the cares and concerns of this world and the deceitfulness of riches choke it out, and it proves to be unfruitful. He says, listen, there is faith, that somebody hears the message of the gospel, but all of their pursuits in life, they're like, boy, I would rather pursue things for me than things of the... I don't want to spend my time reading my Bible and going to church and doing things that are like following godliness, because there's so many appealing things out there. And I think of a young person, and I'm not putting in any suggestion to go to certain colleges or anything. I don't think everybody has to go to Bible college. But let's just say this young person, young faith, and they're like feeling this pressure of like, I really feel God wants me to go to Bible college. But I feel like I could make a lot more money if I pursued worldly things. If I pursued being a doctor, and I'm not saying that's wrong, and I'm not saying God doesn't lead you to that, but if you go against what God is laying on your heart, you say, I want things of this world, and I want money, and you say, I feel that God would want me to go to church, but there's a lot of other things that are so much more appealing to me in life that I would so much rather do, and there's a lot of things I'd rather spend my life doing than doing godly things, so pretty soon, I just find myself doing worldly things. And even though I may claim I have faith in God, I have 100% chosen to live for temporal things with my life. I've done the opposite of what I would do if I had followed godly things. All of my things that I say, what do I work for every day? And what do I pursue every day? And what do I gather for myself every day is not the things of faith. It's the world. And this is James and Jesus say a very similar picture. So in closing here, I want to point out the last verse that James talks about here in verse 12 of chapter 1. And we've looked at this a little bit earlier. We jumped ahead and glanced at it. But he says, blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial. For when he has endured the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him. And James goes on about testing your faith. And then he goes on to money and pursuits. And what are you going to pursue with your life? Because if you pursue the wrong thing with your life, you're going to be like a little plant that gets scalded in the sun. Because you pursued everything that was seasonal and does not last. And he says you're going to kind of bake in the sun, and what you claimed you were all about is going to be shown to be nothing of what you lived for. And he says you'll pass away along with it. And then right after that, James says, endure these testings. Prove yourself to have real faith coming through these testings, that you will receive the crown of life from God. So there's no doubt that there is an element to this, that is, faith is connected to the things you choose to chase after in your life. And once again, I'm not saying that you can't pursue things, or not saying you can't have money, or I'm not saying that pursuing things is the one way to see faith. Faith is almost impossible for me to capture in a small word. James takes a whole book to tell us what faith is. It's just one aspect of saving faith. What did you pursue with your life? And I think, think of all the churches around here that are collapsed. There's an abandoned one up on the hill, the paint's falling off. There's one collapsed across the street. There's one caving in Dosh. There's one just closed, the Christian church in Dosh. There's all the churches around us have caved, and quite likely one day this church will cave under a lot of people who claim they are living by faith, but their daily job and their daily pursuits and the things that they've chosen are more important, even though they claim they have faith. Things that are attended in churches falling off, and things that people would go to in churches, and studies that they would go to in churches, and weekly meetings they would go to in churches, until there's just nothing left in the church. People say, I had faith, but what did you do? Why did you choose everything else? Why did your job become so important that nothing was left? Why was there nothing left for God? You know, there's this element that what did you chase after, right? What did you pursue and what did you chase? What does your life consist of in the end, and what did you live for, and where did you invest, right? Did you invest in eternal things, or did you invest in this life? Because when the sun rises and bakes what you've done, all the temporal will give you a real good view of what your faith really was, based on what you pursued with your life. So, like I say, again, this is just one element of faith. One element. James is giving us a look from every single side as we go around, and then we kind of put the whole picture together. And it's not saying you can't have a good job. It's not saying you can't make money. It's not saying that, but it is saying if you're all about the things that bring you pride in life, and you're all about money in life, and your pursuits are all about your pursuits, then they're not about faith, and that should be a huge red flag. It's one aspect of understanding what saving faith is. So let's go ahead and close in a word of prayer this morning. Our God and Father, I just pray that you just help us to understand throughout this book, as James gives us all of these ways to look at faith and all of these ways to understand what it really is at its core. I pray that you just help us to, as we grow to understand them, to commit to them, to commit to living for eternal things, to commit to living for the things that last in this life, and to find our focus being on the right things, Lord, and all of the things that James is going to bring up in this book. I pray that you just help us to have steadfast faith coming out of this, that we would, as we see each aspect, that we would commit to each aspect, and that you would just make this a church of people who are strong in their faith, who are living for God, and pursuing the things that you want us to pursue. And I just pray that you just help this to be a blessing to each one of us, and I pray this in your Son's name. Amen.